How do parents cultivate godliness in their children?
Let's put that to the test.
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We have recently recorded a couple of episodes on the subject of parenting, and we've really just maybe started by talking about the responsibility that the Lord has given us. When we have children, God expects something from us with those children, and essentially He expects us to bring up those children in a way that they would know Him. We've got a couple of Bible verses that we have focused on. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. And so we've talked a little bit about that responsibility. Maybe in our most recent episode on parenting, we talked specifically about discipline, which is multifaceted. Maybe it's a form of correction. Sometimes it's just maybe done through instruction. But either way, we're trying to do as what Proverbs 22:6 would say, train up a child in the way that he should go. So we know what the responsibility is, but these don't necessarily tell us how to carry that out. And we might think that there are some ways to start. That maybe a good starting place is that we take them to church on a regular basis, even from the youngest of age, and that allows them to be a part of Bible classes and part of worship, and that helps them establish good habits early. But I think as we look at the Scriptures, what we understand is that God is expecting much more than we just get them to church, even if we do that on a regular basis. So we're going to talk this morning about maybe some more practical ways that we can do that outside of the church, specifically in the home. So how do we bring up our children to make decisions just looking through spiritual eyes?
Yeah, you don't want there to be a disconnect between bringing them to services and maybe what you appear to be on a time when you're gathered with God's people for worship, and then what your children see in their day-to-day life with you. If you're bringing them to church and yet your life is filled with worldliness or with hypocrisy, there are challenges that might not be able to be overcome by more teaching. That might not be what is needed. And so you need to put a good example in front of them. But in Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses, as he's talking to the children of Israel about their responsibility to teach their children when they come into the land, he says, beginning in verse 4, that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And so that, with all your might, that I think is fundamental to what's said next. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. These were supposed to be something that they internalized and appreciated. And then in verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk with them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of the house and on your gates. So you've got two things, I think, in this passage. First of all, you have actual, genuine devotion to God on the part of the parents. Not something fake, not a veneer, not some kind of hypocritical service, but real, genuine devotion to God on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you've got them diligently teaching their children, not just on Sundays, not just on Wednesday nights, but day in, day out, using those little moments on the way, coming home, in the bed, before you get up, all of those moments, using those to try to teach and instruct their children in loving the Lord.
Yeah, I like that point that you make, that when we take our children to church, our children should recognize that this is not something out of character with us, that this is very much just a continuation of what we do all week long, really. And I like the fact that you made this point. If we're not consistent in our service to the Lord, then children will immediately recognize that, and that's going to be really hard to overcome.
If teaching our children is something that we find challenging, teaching spiritual things to our children is something that we find challenging, then we really do probably need to look at ourselves a little bit more. This idea that, these things shall be in your heart. When you fill your heart with something, well, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, good or bad. And so when we're filled with serving the Lord and thinking about directing our life by the Lord's instruction, then that's going to be conveyed as we talk to our children in daily conversation.
neither in the Old Testament or the New Testament was the responsibility for children coming to know the Lord placed on the congregation. Parents had that responsibility, and so anything that happens at church is beneficial, can be beneficial and helpful, but it's not how God intended for children to come to know Him. That they would come to know Him through their parents. In this passage, I think we wanted to go on and talk about another part later in the chapter, beginning in verse 20. And this is one of the things that Jared wanted to talk about, part of a specific thing that we do in making decisions, being willing to explain to our children why we do certain things. What is at stake? What are the consequences? What has God said about it? Beginning in verse 20, Moses goes on to say, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean, which the Lord our God commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us up from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. And he brought us up from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he has sworn to our fathers. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always and for our survival as it is today. So there's a number of things built into there. First of all, there's the explanation of why things are being done. Where did we come from? Why is this being done? And then I think there's also the idea of accountability, that this is for our good. We trust the Lord when He tells us something is right, that it's going to be good for us. But He also says for our survival. And I think the implication throughout Deuteronomy is, if we want to continue to experience the Lord's blessings, we're going to listen to what He says, because we are accountable to Him. We answer to Him for our actions.
Yeah, and anything that I say about this, I'm saying as somebody who's trying to produce children who are long-term servants of the Lord, not somebody who's already done that. But I think what we see that the Bible teaches in that regard is that when your child asks you, why do we do this? Why do we follow these commands? Why do we listen to these instructions? You don't just say, well, because that's what we do. Or you don't just say, because I said so. There are times, I think, where it's appropriate to assert parental authority. Maybe as my 3-year-olds, they don't understand the complexities of a lot of things. And so I might have to say, look, this is the way we're doing it right now. But as they begin to age and as they begin to be able to understand, rooting that in our relationship with God and what God's done for us. One writer has said, the son asks about the law and the father responds with a story. He roots it in what God has always done for His people, and then says, and we can trust God, like you just said. And I think that's how we cultivate godliness in our children. It's not just they're following the rules because I'm watching. They're not just following the rules because they're afraid that I'm going to discipline them physically. They are afraid and they're aware and they love God, and they want to do and serve Him, and they understand and trust Him. And I think that's the path to long-term faithfulness, not just faithfulness while they're under my roof, because that's not what I want. That's a short-term goal. What I want is faithfulness when they're 70. And how do I accomplish that? Because I'm not going to be there when they're 70. And by doing that is by teaching them who God is and what He's done.
And one of the things you talked about specifically, Lonnie, was the idea of accountability. So, kind of share some of that with us, some of your thoughts there.
Well, I think it's so important to recognize that we're going to give an account before the Lord. And where we learn so many lessons about our relationship with the Lord is with our parents. I think that God put us in that particular type of arrangement where we have a parent-child relationship, and then He says much of what He says about our relationship with Him is framed in that same type of wording. And I think that's not accidental, that's intentional, because that's where we learn the fundamentals of how to succeed with God. If we're going to succeed with God, we learn a lot of those principles as we deal with our parents in that. And I think a parent teaching accountability to their child, teaching them that when you make a decision, then you're going to have to answer for that decision. And someone's not always going to bail you out of that. And that's something that I think our culture today, we have parents helicopter moms that are so protective. And I understand that. A parent's job is to protect their children, but not to the extent that the child doesn't learn that they're going to have to answer for their own actions on that. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, you have a story about a godly man, Eli. And yet his children were very wicked. His sons were very wicked. And one of the reasons why it says that his sons were wicked is that he did not hold them accountable for their actions. They were They were priests. They were doing things that were immoral. He knew about it. He even reprimanded them, but he did not remove them. He did not really make them answerable for their conduct. And God said, "You honored your sons more than you honored me." Well, it was to his son's detriment that he did that. And if we don't allow our children to face the consequences of their own actions when they're young, then as they're older, in other words, if we say, "Now look, if you do this, this is what's going to happen," and then we bail them out of that, they read what God says, and God says, "Look, if you disobey me, this is what's going to happen." What are they going to think? Well, that's never happened before in my life, and so it's important that we instill in that they'll have to answer for their decisions.
Yeah, and I think that's just one of the ways, and I hope we talk about more. That's just one of the ways where you use day-to-day experiences to cultivate biblical principles, right? This is not just a Sunday, Wednesday thing. This is something that's going to happen every day of the week, that they're going to make decisions that they're going to have to answer for, and that they're going to have to face the consequences of. And so parents who have the long term in mind can look for those opportunities in order to teach that. And in doing so, we're accomplishing one part of what Deuteronomy 6 wants us to accomplish, and that is by teaching them in every different situation of life. So you can use school assignments in order to teach accountability. Now, those things might not be directly spiritual, but they can be used to communicate biblical principles. And when I say directly spiritual, it might not be something that, they're not memorizing Bible verses or something like that. And yet God has something to say about the way we do our work and the way that we face the consequences of the choices that we make.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you were just going to summarize those verses that you read in Deuteronomy chapter 6, maybe the overall message to the parents would be, in your home, make it very clear that God is first priority.
That's right.
And He's going to be, so everything we do, whether it's spiritual or whether it's secular, we're still doing it through spiritual eyes, and we're still doing it with godly principles in mind.
So going back to what you were talking about the idea of making decisions, and particularly when your child asks, why are we doing this? The example that a parent has, I think there's a level of transparency that's very helpful in children, in formulating the thought process of children as they make decisions. So Daddy has an opportunity for a new job, and the family sits down and talks about, well, how are we going to decide whether to take this job? Well, if the whole discussion revolves around, well, it's going to be a huge pay increase, or we're going to have better insurance, or whatever, and there's never the aspect of, well, how is this going to affect us spiritually? Is this going to allow me to have the time to serve the Lord like I need to? Is this going to compromise the responsibilities that God's given me in some way? So children pick up on all of that. They pick up on all of the ways that decisions are made, and those type of things. Where are we going to go on vacation? All of those type of things factor in. And if God is at the center of all of that in daily decisions that are made, and there's a transparency in the family, and the children see how decisions are made, then when they get ready to go to college, what is going to be one of their decisions? Well, this is a great college that offers, the best degree in my field. Or is it going to be, well, is this going to be a place where I can grow spiritually? Is there going to be other faithful Christians there, a congregation that'll help me? When they get ready to date someone and choose a spouse, they're already conditioned to make those type of decisions based upon spiritual things first, because they've seen that in their parents.
One of the things that sometimes I feel like maybe I don't say enough, maybe we don't say it enough, maybe we're hesitant to say it because, it requires discipline, and we realize that we all fall short from time to time. But I think the expectation should be there for all Christians that we're reading the Bible and praying every day. So how can we instill that practice into our children? I don't want to oversimplify things here, but what do you guys think? What were some basic ways to instill that practice into our children, reading and praying at least every day?
Well, doing it with them every day would be a good place to start, wouldn't it? I mean, if we want to show them that that's what the expectation is, then us doing it with them. I can tell you that my parents, there's not anything that they did that has had more of an impact on me that I recognize. I'm sure they did lots of things that have had an impact on me for good. But every night when we came home, before bed, we got our Bibles and we read and we prayed together. And that's a practice that I've tried to replicate with my family. Sometimes I have been more successful in that than at others. there are times where we don't do what we ought to do in that. So I'm not saying this is somebody who has this perfectly down, but the expectation is that we're going to get together every night before we go to bed, and we're going to read and we sing and pray. And I know that I notice a difference in my boys when we're at services, that when we have been practicing that faithfully, they are more engaged in the singing and worship. They already have that kind of, they've been practicing that. And so when we start singing a song that they're familiar with at services, they begin to sing out. And I think the same thing is probably true for adults. The more we do those kind of things on a regular basis, the more comfortable we'll be doing them in the assembly together and things like that. But I think doing it with them is, we recognize the value for ourselves. And parents make sure. I remember a dad one time when I was a kid talking about his daughter playing softball. And he said they went every day after school and practiced, because he said when she gets out there on the field, I want her to be ready. Well, so many parents will take the time to teach their sons to throw a curveball or teach their daughters how to throw a softball because they want them to be ready when it counts. Well, I want my sons to be ready when it counts, when it comes to serving the Lord. Amen. And so if we're going to have that same attitude towards things that ultimately aren't going to be matter a hill of beans, then we need to take that when something's going to matter for eternity.
And this may not be popular either, but do you guys think it would be fair to say that we need to be willing to say no to some things, especially if it's interfering with our ability to read and pray consistently?
I think so, because to me, what all of this kind of keeps coming back to in my mind is consistency. Mm-hmm. And it's consistency in the home, and it's not only that they consistently see us going to worship, but they consistently see us living by the principles. Children are going to hear things as they grow older. They'll pay more attention, and they'll know whether their parents are practicing those things. And then, of course, there's the consistency with the daily reading or singing or praying. And then there's just the consistency of maybe like what Lonnie mentioned, when decisions come, we'll include the family and let your children see how do you go about making a decision through spiritual eyes. Let them see you go through. And, of course, that would require your children to be a little bit older. But nonetheless, I think consistency and transparency is important. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do. My family went on a vacation earlier this year. And one of the things that we made certain to do was we were still going to worship on the Lord's Day, even though we were on vacation. And I'm not certain that all Christians do that, but it was not easy. We were in a place where there wasn't a church, super close by. And I'm not saying this to brag on myself, but we made that a priority, even though our vacation was short. And even though it was not easy to get up and get 3 little ones ready in an unfamiliar environment and drive a long way, we did that. And then we went to worship services on Sunday night. And people might argue, well, if you went on Sunday morning, you did all you had to do, it would be okay. Well, maybe it would be. But we are trying to be consistent, and I'm not going to allow vacation to break that consistency. If I'm going to serve the Lord, I'm going to serve the Lord as consistently as I can, and I want to teach that to my children. And so the last day of our vacation was we got up early, we got ready, we drove to worship services, we had lunch with some of the rest of the family, and we parted ways, and we got back in the car, and we drove and didn't stop until the next time we were at a worship service. And so I wanted my children to see that at a young age, that here's what mom and dad are going to do, even when it might not be easy. And I think coming up this year, if I'm not mistaken, Christmas is on a Wednesday. Well, we consistently go to a Bible study on Wednesday nights at the church. And, it may very well be that a lot of people will take that day off. And our children are going to understand at a young age that just because it's Christmas, we're not going to break our consistency in serving the Lord. And so I think those things are just incredibly important as we think about how do we train them. Well, training is just doing something over and over again, and they need to see us doing it and us helping them understand that too.
And let me just say that we don't do it just to be good examples for our children. We do it because we need to be what we're supposed to be
Sure.
before the Lord. But children do provide a wonderful opportunity and an additional motivation and kind of a reminder of, hey, I need to be who I need to be. And so I think it's somewhat hypocritical to say, well, I'm going to be this so that my children just see a good example, even though I wouldn't normally do it. But there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I can use this as additional motivation to make sure that I'm living the life that I'm supposed to live.
I would have done the same thing even without my children.
That's right. I know. Yes,
No,
I know.
I understand. No, it's a good point that we're doing it because it's who we are, and that
Yes.
again goes back to Deuteronomy 6. It starts in my heart,
Right.
and then the outflow of that is that I'm training my children the same way. And let me say, I'm not just bragging on myself. I'm just citing what I'm trying to do, but I'm maybe inconsistent in some other places, like you mentioned, our bedtime routine with little ones. Well, sometimes I'm a little bit inconsistent with that, especially if it's late and I'm tired and I'm ready to get them to bed. There may be other things where I'm inconsistent, but what I want to try to do is work to where I am consistent in every way.
Well, I was just going to, not to switch gears here, but there is one thing that I wanted to mention before we finish this episode. I want to talk a little bit about some basic principles with money, because I think there's a lot of bad messaging in our culture about money, things that are different than what the Bible says. I would not say that debt is wrong, but the Bible teaches us that debt is limiting. The borrower is slave to the lender in Proverbs 22 and verse 7, I believe that is. So debt is limiting. And at the same time, the Proverbs also teach us to save money, that when there's extra money, we don't just spend it. I think in Proverbs 25 and verse 16, it's the idea of finding honey. Just eat as much as you need, instead of just wasting it up and making yourself sick. And there are other passages that would talk about saving and then giving to the Lord. So if we're having trouble, if we're having trouble to live our lifestyle without racking up a bunch of debt, we're not saving, and we're not really giving generously to the Lord, we're not making good choices with our money, and we are listening more to the messages of the culture than the messages of Scripture. And those, my concern is the fact that we'll be limited spiritually. That's the thing. When the Bible says this is wise, and we want to avoid a lot of trouble, and sometimes maybe a person feels like they have to work because they know the bills are this high. And so they end up sacrificing some service and some opportunities because of that sort of thing. And, it goes back maybe to being willing to say no about some things and explaining to children these principles, why we're saying no. And when you're an adult, you will need to say no. If you're not saving money on a regular basis, you're going to need to make some changes, because that's going to be what's best for you. Going to give you some, there's no certainty in money, but we can use it or we can misuse it. And the Bible makes that clear. Nobody would disagree with that.
Right. And so maybe when it comes to, like, for instance, last night we were in a store with our young children, and they wanted to buy everything that they saw that they liked. And of course, at this age, you just kind of say no. But as they get older, we might explain and use, again, opportunities to explain why we wouldn't use all of our money on things like that, and why we want to use some of our money to save, and we want to use some to dedicate to the Lord. So I think this is actually a little bit over our normal time, but I think we've had some good things to say. I'd want to say just one more really quick thing. To emphasize how important it is we start early with our children. There are some recent surveys out there done by the Barna Group, and what the youngest generation right now coming up, only 16% of them have grown up and right now say that growing spiritually is important to them. And I think maybe that's a product of they just didn't grow up in an environment that saw spiritual things important. And so now when they grow up and start trying to make decisions on their own. But I think it's so important that we understand we've got our children for a limited time. And so we need to do all that we can with them to train them up in the way that they should go. And if we don't do that, don't be surprised if our children are in that large majority who just don't have an eye for spiritual things anymore. So thank you for listening to our podcast. Perhaps there are things you'd like to question about this subject, or maybe there are other subjects that you would like to hear us discuss. You can reach out to us on Facebook or via email, proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.
Something else. Do I want to state one of the obvious things is that we would bring them to church on a regular basis, but maybe we're thinking about doing even, more than just that.
What?
Teaching
More?
life lessons.
Yeah.
Tad's just being encouraging today, so I can't trust anything he says.
Yeah, Ted.
He's just like, Larson, you're a great preacher.
You
can
wasn't
preach.
going that far.
Yeah, he's like, you can preach 3 sermons in one. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I do think you're a great preacher.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm as
Are you
surprised
hearing
as you are.
Are you hearing this right now?
Yeah. Train up a child in the way he should go.
This doesn't happen to me normally.
Sorry, Lonnie. I feel like he's losing respect for me every second. Like I'm trying to rein it in. I'm trying to be a bigger person.